Iris Marion Young makes a more radical argument based about socialization than just this one that we've seen here. So the more radical argument is from a classic paper that Young wrote, which is called Throwing Like a Girl. And this is a classic kind of paper in feminist philosophy. It's something that I would encourage everybody to read if they're interested in feminist philosophy. Um, and the argument that she makes kind of goes like this. So she says that a lot of the differences that we think are kind of brute biological differences are sex differences in terms of the way that girls and boys move around space, they compete in sports, are active. All of these things that people assume are kind of innate natural differences based on biology. Young wants to argue that a lot of these differences can be explained by socialization. So she writes, quote, "For many women as they move in sport, a space surrounds us in imagination that we are not free to move beyond. The space available to our movement is a constricted space." And so she argues that because of the way that they're socialized, girls are not encouraged to kind of take up as much space as boys. And this is kind of, she means this in quite a literal sense. So in terms of how girls are encouraged to use their bodies, they're encouraged to think very carefully about the space that they're taking up and try and minimize the physical space that they're taking up. And this is something that, because it's reinforced from such an early age, Young argues is going to have heavy-tailed impacts on how girls feel comfortable using their bodies. So she argues that, yeah, girls are not typically afforded the freedom to take up as much space. And so she writes, "Girls and women are not given the opportunity to use their full bodily capacities in free and open engagement with the world." So the idea here is that if girls were socialized perhaps in the same way as boys, then the differences in how boys and girls use their bodies would be minimized. So Young wants to argue that this is kind of making a prediction, but based on some pretty solid reasoning, in my view, that a lot of the things that we might assume are biological differences are actually going to be things that could be partially explained by socialization. And so the example that she chooses, which is throwing like a girl, is something that is kind of grown into through culture rather than being natural. And Young takes a lot of inspiration from Simone de Beauvoir's analysis of girlhood and womanhood when she's making this argument. So this might be something that is interesting to consider when we think about the future of sports, because a lot of the arguments that we've seen rely on certain empirical premises about biological differences between girls and boys. But if we think that these are not biological differences, or at least partially not biological differences, but are social differences, then one of the priorities might be the strength of these arguments might differ in terms of how much they justify going into the future. I might also think that there are interesting justifications that potentially could be given to the single sex characteristics here, which is that single sex supporting categories here, which is if you think that a lot of the differences are going to be social, then it might provide a temporary justification for having women's only sports in order to try and counteract some of these social differences. So having spaces where women and girls are encouraged to take up as much space as they need to not kind of have this mental block of a constricted space around you while moving. So again, there's kind of differences in how we can use this argument, I think, and it's worth investigating as a kind of classic paper to incorporate in your research.